One of the features I forgot to mention in the photo styles yesterday was the fact of customizing the profile and applying that to the custom profile in the setup. Remember, we have the photo styles of standard, vivid, natural, monochrome, scenery, portrait, and the last one was custom. I said you could apply any option you like within this and it would modify that custom setup. What I should have actually described was the method of doing the customization. So if we go into photo styles and say I like the scenery mode that camera gives, but it just gives a little bit too much saturation for me, I could reduce that saturation by going to the saturation setup, cursoring down, reducing the saturation, and then applying that to the custom setting. When you press the menu set button, that now actually do want to overwrite the current custom settings, and you say yes. It then switches to the custom mode for you, and you can see that in custom the actual bottom now says scenery, and it has brought through the settings that we saved in the scenery mode of +1 sharpening, -2 saturation and -2 noise reduction, and you can save that in any profile. So for example, if I went through to the standard mode and I changed the sharpening to +1 instead of +2, if I go down to the custom setting and overwrite the current settings, again if I go into the custom profile, you can see that we've got the +1 sharpening, -2 noise reduction applied to the standard photo style. While we're talking about focus, it's probably now time to talk about the depth of field, or sometimes called depth of focus, that the camera exhibits using different apertures and lens zoom positions. You may be aware that in a wide aperture situation the depth of field is a lot greater than in a telephoto one, and also that the lens aperture also affects the depth of field. A large aperture, i.e. a small f number like f2.8, gives you a shallow depth of field, and a larger f number like f8 gives you a greater depth of field. To give you some idea of how that works, I've set up this display here so we can actually focus on one particular area, and then you'll be able to see the amount of depth of field at different f-stops. On the model I'm going to photograph, I'm going to set the focal distance to the 10 centimeter mark on this rule. I'm going to take the picture at f2.8 and we should see there's a slight amount of depth of field in front of the 10 centimeter mark, and there'll be a depth of field beyond the 10 centimeter mark. We'll then change the lens f-stop to f8 and then look at the amount of depth of field that the camera exhibits using that f-stop. You might be interested then to see that to actually photograph this scene in reality, I wouldn't focus on the front of this first vehicle, I'd actually focus slightly into the picture, which gives me an amount of focus in front and an amount of focus behind, and that way I'll get more depth of field than just focusing on this first object and hope that the last one becomes in focus. So let's see that in practice. So first of all I need to set up the camera for single area focus, and that's indicated by this little icon on the top, and we saw that in the last video. There are three ways to achieve this. You can either use the quick menu to get to the autofocus option here to select single point, or you can use the navigation menu here on the left hand side, or you can use the focus button on the side of the camera, whichever one's applicable. In this case I'll use the one on the back of the navigation button as that's easier for me to reach. So I go into one area and then use the cursor to come to the right, and then that gives me access to changing the size and position of this focus target. So I'm going to bring the focus target down to the 10 centimeter mark, change the size of the focus to the smallest area, and then select it to the 10 centimeter area. We'll set that in position. I'm now going to take the photograph here at f2.8 and I'll use a self timer. When we see that in the video, we'll be able to see the amount of focus in front that's critically sharp and the amount of focus behind, which is critically sharp, at the f2.8 setting. I'm now going to change the lens aperture to f8. The method I'm going to use to change the aperture is called Program Shift, and it's this feature within the P menu. so that the camera will maintain the correct exposure if you change the aperture and shutter combination. So if I have to press the shutter button, the camera gives me the exposure and it turns yellow, which means I've now got control of the aperture shutter combination. And if I use the top control dial while it's still active, I change to the program shift mode, and that's indicated by the P and the double-headed arrow. So I'm now going to change that aperture shutter value combination to f8, and if you notice, as I change the aperture to a smaller value, the shutter speed decreases, so i.e. the time gets longer to maintain the correct exposure value. So I'm going to change now to f8 and again take the photograph, and we'll be able to now see that there's a lot more depth of field in front of the target area and behind the target area. So I'll take away the rule and repeat that so we can actually see the photograph in final production. The program shift that's locked into the camera will stay active even if you momentarily went into another mode. So for example, if I suddenly saw a scene that I wanted to photograph and I put the camera in IA mode just to get that picture without having any setup to do, the camera will remember the program shift mode that we've engaged, and when I come back into the P mode, it will have remembered the program shift as indicated again by the camera. If you wanted to release the program shift, then you just turn the control dial until the double-headed arrow turns off, and that's normally at the 2.8 setting. Let's now look at the manual focus mode, and I get more questions on how to set up the manual focus mode than any other mode this camera exhibits. It's really a simple process, and it's just a logical one that you have to drive your mind into. The manual focus obviously gives you the option to set the focal point to where you want on the scene. To engage manual focus, we slide the switch on the side of the camera to the MF position, and that's indicated by the MF symbol appearing on the LCD display. Once you switch to the manual focus position, the way to engage manual focus is to use the top control dial. The top control dial is the key to setting up the manual focus. Immediately you change to manual focus, you end up with the manual focus in control, so that is the icon highlighted in yellow. If that icon isn't in yellow, i.e. if you've selected a different mode, so for example if you've selected exposure value compensation, the manual focus will not work for you. You have to have the manual focus set to yellow to enable this mode. So again, one depress of the control dial puts me in control of manual focus. Now when I rotate the control dial, we will get control of the manual focus. So if I click to the right, you can see that the display brings up a manual focus screen, and on that screen you can see the distance from 0.01 of a meter over to infinity. So once you're in this mode, you've got two methods to change the actual focus point. You have either the top control dial, which I'm using now, to change the focus position, or you can use the navigation buttons left or right, whichever you prefer. As you do so, you can see on the screen the focus point change. And it's a magnified view. I can then use the navigation button or the top control dial to set the accurate focus point, and it's better if you just go through the focus point and then just step back into it to get the actual focus point you desire. I think one of the problems with the manual focus method is the fact that you have to be fairly quick with the operations when you go into the menu. For example, if you wanted to change the position of the focus area, you only get 1 second when you go into the manual focus setting to enable that mode. To do that, we turn the top control dial to the right, which gives us control of manual focus, and then within the first second you have to press the menu set button, which will then give you the option to move the focus area. Unlike the autofocus single area, you can't change the size of the image. You can only change the position at which you're going to focus. So I'm going to try and do this fairly quickly. I'm going to enable the manual focus mode by rotating the dial to the right and then immediately press menu set to get control of that. So manual focus, menu set. Now it's given me the opportunity to move the position of the target. So I'm going to center that over the cab of the first vehicle. Once we've established the position we want to photograph, press the menu set button, and that takes us into the adjustment, and again we can use the navigation buttons to set the point of focus. If you're going to do a lot of photography which involves a lot of manual focus, there is a facility in the menu to change the side lever from a zoom operation to a manual focus operation, and that gets around all this problem of depressing menu buttons to enable you to get into manual focus. To enable that facility, you need to go into the menu, and it's in the tools option. So we're going to menu, cursor across and down to tools, and then we can cursor through until we see side lever. I've got it set for focus. It's normally on zoom, so as you move the lever up and down the camera zoom position will change, but I want that to be enabled for focus. So if I come down to focus and press menu set, so now when we come back to the display screen to take the photograph, if I operate the side lever on the side of the camera, as I depress it or lift it up, you can see that I've gained access to the focus point, and I can change the focus a lot easier than using the manual control buttons. If the camera is a long way out of focus, there's a quick shortcut to bring it into focus. So if I just momentarily go into change the focus position, I'll use the side lever and I'll put it all the way over to infinity. And to enable you to get to manual focus and without having to go through the process of using the control buttons to get you to a focal point, you can use the focus button on the side of the camera, and that will force the camera to do an automatic focus single shot. You can then go into your manual focus position and change it if you felt that you needed to just fine tune that, but the camera normally gets it pretty spot on. You'll notice when we go into manual focus, the focus scale indicates the actual focal distance between the camera and the subject, and the width of the bar actually determines the amount of depth of field. So it gives you an indication of the amount of depth of field you've got for this particular scene. So if I engage manual focus, you can see that the bar is very narrow, so the amount of depth of field is quite small. This will depend on the telephoto setting of the lens. If I zoom out slightly, when I go into manual focus now, you can see that the depth of field is much larger, and that is because of the change in the focal length of the lens. The wider the focal length, the more depth of field you'll have. So you can see in the subject now we've got the front of the image and the rear in perfect focus. So the more telephoto you set on, the narrower the depth of field becomes. You can use that to your advantage if you want to take photographs of plants against the background and blur the background, or a portrait against the background, or if you wanted maximum depth of field, then obviously use f8 and a wider angle setting, and that will give you the maximum depth of field you can from this camera. So far we've only talked about static focus. So what if our subject is actually moving and we've got a dynamic motion in our subject? There are two methods the camera gives us to try and capture motion in our subject. The first one is called autofocus flexible, the AFF mode. The other one is called autofocus continuous, the AFC mode. There is a slight difference in the method in which the camera focuses, and I'll try and demonstrate that with the subject in motion now. Well, that's it for this second part of installment 3 of the video series. In the next part I want to look at the remaining options in the P mode. That's going to be exposure compensation and exposure bracketing, and have a look at these features such as eye dynamic, and in the next page the eye resolution effects, what they give to the photograph, what to be aware of if you engage them, and I'll show you some images I've shot with and without those modes to give you some idea of its capability. So until then, thanks very much for watching again, and I hope to see you in that video. Bye for now.